Well, good morning, everybody. Happy weekend before Christmas. Do you have big plans? I'm betting a good number of you are going to be attending Christmas parties tonight, tomorrow, on and on. The next few days are going to be pretty busy. And if that's the case, if you've got events with people coming up, if you're not just having the big parties alone in your basement, if you've got people there, you're going to want to stay tuned. You're listening to the RepcoLite Home Improvement Show 2024 Christmas Extravaganza, sponsored by Benjamin Moore. And we're doing a 2024 Christmas Extravaganza because, hey, first off, it's 2024, so that's the right time to do that. But secondly, I don't feel like home improvement stuff this week. That's the paint point for the week. I don't feel like a paint point. I feel like talking about Christmas. So we're going to talk about fun stuff. And like I said, if you've got parties or events coming up, tonight, tomorrow night, anytime in the near future, you need to stay tuned. I've got so many fun Christmas facts for you that you're going to be able to amaze your friends and family with all of your knowledge and your wit and your wisdom. And while you're going to be able to blow them away, and I do want you to let them, think for a while that all of this knowledge is innate, that you just possess this and you're just cranking it out at a whim. Let them think that for a while, but then let them know that you did get some of it. You don't have to tip your hand and say you got all of it here. Let them know you got some of it by checking out the radio show. So steer them to catch the radio show in the future, or better yet, direct them to the podcast. Anywhere they get their podcasts, you can catch the RepcoLite Home Improvement Show. So do that for me. That's your gift to me, and I greatly appreciate that. And my gift to you is the rest of this show. It's 100% fun. And like I said, I've got a bunch of different stories, a bunch of different facts, little trivia things that you can take to whatever party. And even if you don't care to do that, there's a lot of really interesting stuff. We're going to talk about some surprising stories about the origins of a Christmas song that we're all familiar with, surprising origins to where that song came from. We'll talk about that. We'll also talk about, kind of a sad story behind one of the most iconic Christmas stories of all time. And yeah, that's what everybody wants, kind of a sad story about some Christmas story. But the good news is, even though there's a little bit of a sad aspect to it, it's got a really good payoff, a really happy ending. So we'll get to that. But before we jump into all of that, I want to talk about the story of the Christmas Truce of 1914. I'm sure you've heard of it. It's one of those moments where humanity and kindness and all of the good things, that we like to think about in this world, the things that we can do when everything really clicks, all of that goodness shines in the middle of a really, really dark time. So I know you've probably heard of this before, soldiers on opposite sides of the Western Front laying down their weapons to celebrate Christmas together. I can't remember where and when I first heard about this, but I do know that the story always had, almost like a magical quality to it. It seemed too perfect, really, too good to be true. Maybe you've thought that too. I know I certainly have. But if you have, what would you think if I told you there's more to the story than what most of us learned in school? And not all of those things are going to dispel the myth of the story or the idea of the story. I shouldn't call it a myth because it's not. It really happened. Some of the things will temper some of the items that we know, some of the stories that we hear. I've got probably the true version of what went down. But then there's other things that I'd never heard before that make the story even better. So let's get to that. Let's talk about some of these lesser-known details, and it'll just set the pace, set the tone for the rest of the show. All right, 1914. It's December 1914, and we're just a few months into what was then called the Great War. All right, soldiers are on both sides. They're entrenched along the Western Front, and initially, the war was expected to be super quick, over by Christmas. It's not going to take any time at all. It'll almost be fun. That's how wars used to be. It'll be fun for a while. Civil War, same thing. Then they realize, no, this really stinks and it's going to last for a very long time. And, December 1914, the reality of this prolonged and brutal conflict was really starting to set in. So, of course, you've got morale that's really low. The freezing conditions, they're not helping anything. The conditions in the trenches, miserable, absolutely miserable. Everything is terrible. Then, in the midst of that, something really, really crazy and incredible happened. Almost a little Christmas miracle. On Christmas Eve, German soldiers begin singing carols. British troops across no man's land, they hear the songs and they join in. And then what starts as this caroling kind of a thing grows into more as the two sides eventually end up shouting holiday greetings at each other and, cautiously even emerging from their trenches to meet each other halfway across the field. By Christmas morning, in several places along the front, the war had literally been paused and enemies were shaking hands, singing songs, possibly even playing soccer. It's one of those stories, like I said, that really hits hard. Even in the dark of war, there's this shared humanity, the shared experience of Christmas that has the power to draw people together, even in the midst of war. It's pretty crazy. But like I said, there's more to this story than we always realize. Now, first off, let's get to some of these. It wasn't universal. It's easy to alter the story in the telling and, kind of make it out to be the case that everywhere the soldiers laid down their weapons. But that's not the case. There wasn't this universal moment of peace that swept across the entire front. Some areas, the Scroogey areas, they kept fighting as usual, and others experienced, only brief, cautious interactions. It really depended on the soldiers and their proximity to each other. But there were certain areas where literally it was a full-blown truce for the course of a day or so. All right. Second thing, it wasn't officially sanctioned. This truce wasn't something that came down from higher channels. In fact, when they heard about it, people in high command on both sides tended to disapprove of it. This was news to me. It makes sense, but they feared it was going to weaken soldiers' resolve to fight each other. And in some cases, as it was happening, if there were officers there, some of those officers ordered their men and their troops to just stop being nice and resume hostilities. They just didn't want to have this happen. They didn't think it was a good idea. So that's an interesting thing I wasn't aware of. Gifts were exchanged. I know I've always heard that, but among the soldiers who participated in the truce, there really was this great big makeshift gift exchange that occurred, like Secret Santas. It happened out there. People shared simple gifts. They had whatever they had. They had cigarettes, chocolate, maybe alcohol. A lot of the times, even buttons, badges from the uniform, they'd cut those off and exchange them. So that really took place. That soccer match, let's get to that. I mentioned it earlier that maybe there was a big soccer match. I know we hear a lot about that. The idea of a full-blown soccer game happening is probably one of those notions that just sounds really good, really adds to the story, but the truth is it's probably a bit of a stretch. There are a number of accounts out there of moments when some people informally kind of kicked a ball around, but it doesn't sound like those were any kind of organized matches of the kind that, we hear about all the time. Still, when you think about it, even a quick informal game, to pass a few minutes with people who had previously been trying to kill you, it's still pretty cool. Doesn't need to be a full-blown soccer match for me to think that's pretty cool, pretty amazing. Another little, maybe lesser-known fact, or something that at least we can put a stamp of, yes, this is real on, carols really did spark the truce. I mentioned it earlier, but music played this key role, and the Germans started singing Still Nacht. I have no idea how to say that. I could have looked it up. I didn't, because probably I wouldn't be able to say it anyway, and my accents aren't all that great. And really, to be honest, most of my accents are drawn from stereotypes that I picked up from cartoons that I watched when I was little. So chances are it would have been offensive had I tried. So Still Nacht, they start singing that. The British recognize it, of course, as Silent Night. And this shared song and the shared meaning behind it, really created this bridge between the soldiers in the opposing trenches. It's crazy to think about to me. But that song, Silent Night, when you look into it, it was first performed back in 1818. That's the first time it was performed. And that's about 100 years before this event in 1914. And I can only imagine if the composer of that song could have heard, all the renditions that ever occurred since he wrote that song. I got a feeling that this particular one and the resulting truce, even though it was just temporary, this version had to be one of the most rewarding. To write a song that ends up sparking this truce in the midst of this horrible, horrible war, that's pretty powerful. All right, another interesting fact is that the truce wasn't all about celebration. In many areas, it allowed soldiers to recover bodies from no man's land and bury their dead. And there are even stories of shared burial ceremonies with prayers offered in multiple languages. Again, really, really amazing stuff. Surprisingly, another fact, soldiers in some sectors didn't just talk. They actively helped each other. There are accounts of men repairing barbed wire and then strengthening trenches together before returning to their respective sides. Amazing. After the truce ended, a large number of soldiers expressed regret. This part really isn't surprising to me at all. They expressed regret, finding it really hard, crazy difficult to resume fighting after meeting their enemies face to face. This is one of the reasons that upper command, higher command didn't want these kinds of things to happen, but really played out. It's hard to go back to battle when you were all working together the day before or hours before. After 1914, another interesting fact, high command on both sides took measures to prevent future truces, and the story itself wasn't widely celebrated or spread during the war. Instead, it lived on in soldiers' letters and diaries. That's how we know about it. It wasn't, touted as a story that got spread outside of the soldiers themselves telling it. Now, what makes the Christmas Truce of 1914 so compelling to me isn't, it's not just that brief pause in fighting. It's the power of the day, the power of Christmas that really kind of gets me. Sounds kind of dumb, but these were people who were ordered to hate and kill each other. But, they're sitting there looking at this shared holiday. They're approaching Christmas Eve. They've got to be, they're young men. They've got to be thinking about the years before, on that night, the years before, what they would have been doing, the hopes and dreams that they had as kids, waiting for that next morning, to see the presents, the food, and the get-together, all of the things that Christmas brings to, both sides of this particular conflict. The peace, all of the ideas, everything behind Christmas, all of that has to be resonating in their minds as they're thinking about their situation now, that they're in these trenches, in a life and death struggle, and nobody knows how it's going to go, how it's going to shake out. Those moments had to just really stir up the nostalgia and just the longing for what Christmas really speaks to. And from there, somebody starts singing this hymn, this carol that everybody else knows, Silent Night, and before long, a ton of people are joining in. It's really amazing to think that even in the darkest of situations, Christmas still shines this beautiful and powerful light. All right, there you go. That's the history, the real history, as far as I know it, of the Christmas Truce of 1914. We're off and running on our Christmas extravaganza. We're going to take a break, and when we come back, I've got a surprising story regarding the origins of a really popular Christmas song. That's coming up next. Stick around. Welcome back. You're listening to the RepcoLite Home Improvement Show's 2024 Christmas Extravaganza, and we're off to a rollicking start. And really, we're a few days away from Christmas, and I'm sorry. I'm just not in the mood to talk about paint. I'm just not feeling it. And honestly, I really do hope you're not in the mood to listen to me talk about paint. There's bigger fish to fry right now, and yeah, it's not home improvement stuff. We'll get back to that stuff soon in the next couple weeks, but for right now, we're kicking back and we're having a little Christmas fun as we look ahead to the holiday. And right now, I want to take a look at the interesting history behind a popular Christmas song, Do You Hear What I Hear? Right? You know that one? Do you hear what I hear? I'm not going to sing it. I struggled just to say it that last time. Right there, I stumbled over everything. To start with, I want to be really, really straight up honest. This has never been one of my favorite Christmas songs, right? It's right up there for me with Little Drummer Boy and some of the other ones. It's a real snoozer for me. Not a big fan. But there's such a good story behind it that I think it's moving up my list. It's still not going to displace some of the leading songs on there, but it's way moved up. All right, and maybe that will happen for you too. Now, chances are, when most of us think about the song, do this right now. Think about when the song was written. When do you think it came about? Most of us probably figure it's some kind of older traditional carol, but it's actually, surprisingly, quite modern compared to what I was thinking anyway. And it was written as a plea for peace during one of the most terrifying moments in modern history, at least in regards to American history. So let's go back to October 1962. The U.S. is in the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And to quickly just summarize that time period and the situation, if you're not familiar, let's just say the world was on edge because the United States and the Soviet Union, we were in a standoff over Soviet nuclear missiles that had been placed in Cuba. That's why they called it the Cuban Missile Crisis. If it had been placed somewhere else, they would have called it by a different name. But anyway, Cuba, that's where these missiles are at. There's a lot of anxiety. What's going to happen? Some of you were alive back then, and I'm sure you remember the tension. I was not. Far too young for that. 6 more years had to pass. No, 10 more years had to pass before I graced the world with my presence. But some of you, 10 years older than me, no, you were just babies then. Chances are you don't remember anything. Anyway, I'm on a tangent that doesn't need to happen. Some of you remember what was going on back then. Wish I could fix my brain and just not get hooked into those things. Some of you were worried that we were on the brink of nuclear war back then, right? Now in New York City, against that backdrop, Noel Rainey, Regney, a French-born composer, and his American wife, Gloria Shane Baker, a talented pianist in her own right, those guys were approached to write a Christmas song. Now, the two had collaborated often in the past. They were a songwriting duo. They were like Batman and Robin, only with songs, but maybe not quite as famous as Batman and Robin. Again, I'm going to avoid one of those tangents I don't need. They were an accomplished duo writing a large number of pop songs. But anyway, they get approached to write this Christmas song, and really, with the timing and all of that, this request felt crazy tough to pull off. Just how are we going to do this? They're both freaked out about what's going on in the world, worried that cooler heads aren't going to prevail and that chaos and destruction are looming just ahead. Everything felt dark right in those particular days during this crisis, and that's when they were asked to write the song. Everything felt heavy. It just didn't seem possible for them to sit down and write some cheery little Christmas jingle in the midst of all of that. And really, that's not me just being overly dramatic. Noel, Noel, I don't know how to say it, Noel, later explained in interviews or in writing, somewhere he explained, that in the recording studio during that time period, his producer kept checking the radio between takes, checking the news to find out if the worst had happened, if missiles had been launched. So that's what's going on. That's the mindset that everybody's in. So Rainey is supposed to write this Christmas song for Harry Simeone. I'm sure some of you know Harry Simeone and the Harry Simeone Chorale. I have no idea how to pronounce that name. Hopefully you know what I'm talking about. This is the group that also is famous for the Little Drummer Boy song, which seriously evokes responses similar to Mariah Carey's All I Want for Christmas Is You song. People love it or hate it. Anyway, he's supposed to write a Christmas song, to go on the album for this Harry Simeone Chorale, to go on the album with the Little Drummer Boy. And Rainey has no idea how he's going to do it, how he's going to channel the muse and come up with words of peace and love and all of that when he's not feeling any of it. And honestly, when no one is. So that's what's going on. That's what the world is doing right now. That's what the world is thinking. That's what the world is feeling right now. The furthest thing from Christmas cheer that you can imagine. Now that's tough, right? That's a tough job to have to come up with something cheery with all of that going on. But there's another element to the story that further explains his feelings and further complicates things. And we're going to get to that on the other side of the break. So stick around. And we're back. You're listening to the RepcoLite Home Improvement Show Christmas Extravaganza, brought to you by Benjamin Moore. And I'm in the middle of a story about the Christmas song, Do You Hear What I Hear? That's a song that's not as old as we typically think. It was written in 1962 in the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And I explained in the last segment that the composers, Noel Rainey and his American-born wife, Gloria Shane Baker, they had been hired to write this Christmas song, and they were struggling to get in the spirit of the season since the world was literally melting down at that point. But on top of all of those common fears that people were fearing as, the missile crisis was growing in intensity, I mentioned that Rainey also had another experience that made the thought of war even more impactful on his psyche. And that's where we left off. So I'm going to pick it up right there. See, Rainey had been born in Strasbourg, France, and when the Nazis overran his country in World War II, he was conscripted into the German army against his will. However, instead of serving loyally, he ended up becoming a double agent for the French resistance. He wore a German uniform, but he worked for the French resistance. And one particular mission that haunted him the rest of his life was a time when he led a group of German soldiers into an ambush. He was wounded in the process, probably intentionally, to make the whole thing look real and not blow his cover. And though he survived that particular event, the memory of that day haunted him for the rest of his life. Now, after the war, Noel moved to the United States, and that's where he met his wife, and the two began this career in music. Now, as I said, Rainey's upset about the missile crisis, right? And the terrible events that he witnessed in World War II, those are hanging over him. All of it's probably getting dredged back up, and he's really hitting a point where he doesn't know how to come up with this song, how to do what he's tasked to do. And so he goes walking around New York City trying to find some inspiration, but every single place that he goes, everybody that he sees is just down in the dumps. Everything feels heavy. The people walking past are sad. They're lost in their own worlds. They're just doing what they need to do, grinding out the day-to-day stuff. But everybody's just too concerned to be cheerful or upbeat or even remotely friendly. There's just this all-pervasive sense of despair that's hanging over everything. And in the midst of all of that, as he's ready to give up, he sees something that he says changed everything. He sees two young mothers with their babies in strollers. Like I said, everybody's down, everybody's quiet. The mothers are down, they're quiet. But the babies are laughing and smiling and carrying on with each other. They're oblivious to the fear and the tension that is just everywhere around them. Now, he later went on to say that all of a sudden, when he saw those kids, those babies, his mood was extraordinary. He explained that the innocence of the babies reminded him of newborn lambs, and just like that, the opening lyrics of the song came to him in a flash. Said the night wind to the little lamb, do you see what I see? Well, if you've ever been struggling, for inspiration and it finally strikes, you know the feeling. You feel like you've caught lightning, but you don't know how long it's going to last, how long you can hold it before it gets away. So the race was on. Rainey takes this idea. He's got this idea in the back of his mind, these first opening lyrics. He takes those ideas and he runs home, heads straight home and busts into his house, sits down and cranks out this entire song, all of the lyrics. He then brings it to his wife and she goes to work and soon has a melody composed to go along with it. And together, against all odds, they ended up creating this song that wasn't just about Christmas. It was a plea for peace in the midst of a very real and very terrifying situation. And that's what really makes me reassess what I think of that song. And I guess I really don't know why that really hits me. I always knew the song was a prayer for peace. It's a key part of the lyrics. You'd have to not be paying attention to not understand that the song's about peace. But knowing that it wasn't just a feel-good concept or just a generic prayer for peace, written from a place of comfort and stability, I think that gives the words more weight to me. Rainey and his wife and much of the world at that point didn't know what was coming. And even though neither of them, the two of them weren't profoundly religious from what I'm reading, they still found peace in a rock-solid concept, the true meaning and power of Christmas. Their prayer for peace in the song wasn't just this generic Christmas wish. It was really, really deeply personal. In fact, they both explained later that they couldn't perform the song without tearing up. Anyway, the song debuted in 1962, recorded, as I said earlier in the last segment, by the Harry Simeone Choral. And I think Harry Simeone, no idea how to say that. It's a name. It's not a descriptor. They weren't a hairy chorale of horses or of people. A choral, like a choir. You know what I'm saying. I don't have to explain. The Harry Simeone, the person's choir. They debuted the song, but it was Bing Crosby's 1963 version that made it a Christmas staple. And since then, artists from Whitney Houston to Carrie Underwood have recorded it, and there's over 100 versions that exist today. Now, one last interesting tidbit. Noel's favorite version is Robert Goulet's. Now, I was unfamiliar with this version, and I had to look it up. And when I did, I realized right away, I've heard that version 100 times, but you should go check it out. Noel loved how Goulet's version builds in intensity with each verse until at the end, he's almost shouting the line, "Pray for peace, people everywhere." You know, it just emphasizes the urgency of the message. So there you go. Next time you hear Do You Hear What I Hear, you can think about the deeper message and how the song came to be. Or you can, as it's going, explain to the people in your car or the people nearby all this cool stuff that I told you. You choose what you want to do with the information I've given you. All right, let's take a break, and when we come back, I've got that somewhat sad story with a happy ending about one of the most iconic Christmas stories of all time. That's coming up next. Stick around. And we're back. You're listening to the RepcoLite Home Improvement Show 2024 Christmas Extravaganza, sponsored by Benjamin Moore. Now, growing up, Christmas was my absolute favorite holiday. That's probably the case with most kids. I was completely wrapped up in the commercial aspect of it. I get that. I admit that. My name's Dan. I was attracted to the commercial aspects of Christmas. I liked presents. I think a lot of us, if we're honest, that's where we are. I mean, there's some of those kids who were truly only and solely devoted to the religious aspects, the deeper meanings of Christmas. I liked those things, but I sure did like getting stuff. I really did like that, and honestly, there were so many things about Christmas, about the Christmas season that I loved. We were off from school for 2 whole weeks. That was great. It was usually snowy outside. There was a ton of fun outdoor things to do. The Christmas tree and all the decorations in the house, those were big deals to me. I loved how the season came into our lives once a year, and it changed everything. Even in the house, everything changed because of Christmas. I love the parties that we would go to. My Grandma Hanson, she especially made memorable and over-the-top Christmas parties that we all still talk about all these years later. I love the movies that we'd watch and just the build-up to the day itself. Everything about it was magical. It still is. But as you grow up, you kind of get to see how the sausage is made, so to speak. I won't say more than that if there are kids listening, but the mystery behind the magic is explained a little bit, and it often feels more like work than it does when you're little. But still, it's one of my favorite seasons, and yes, there's a lot more to it than the commercial aspect, and now I get all of that. There's a much deeper meaning and much more importance on the day. Whether you're religious or not, the day still represents a lot more than just the presents. But still, the presents aren't bad. Anyway, I'm dishing out presents on the show today, and I just told you about one of the Christmas songs that I never cared for all that much and how that song came to be. And when I realized the story behind it, I found myself liking that song more and more. Hopefully, you had that experience as well, or maybe you just snagged some trivia that you can break out at your next Christmas gathering. Well, let's do it again, but this time, let's keep the big reveal a little more secret. So this is my last gift to everybody out there, and I think this is a ton of fun. Let's talk about how a famous Christmas story came to be and see if you can figure it out as we go. Now, it all starts back in the year 1905, when the author of the story in question was born in New York to an affluent, a well-to-do, happening family. He was a quiet and introverted kid, kind of kept to himself, and he was typically, as a result, overshadowed by the more outgoing kids. That's how it goes for us introverts. I was always incredibly shy, and the louder kids, it's always hard for people who meet me to believe that I truly am an introvert, and I fake it for the radio, and I fake it when I meet people at events. But inside, I'm a cringing, cowering, shy little kid still. And the confident kids, when I was in school, man, they always outshone me. And the same was true for the author that we're focusing on, all right? That's important. Keep that in mind. There's evidence out there that he skipped a grade or two in school, that he advanced quicker, and that made him younger and smaller than his classmates, something that really only added to his feeling of being an outsider. I haven't been able to verify that entirely, but the idea is out there. What we do know is that he kind of thought of himself as a bit of a nerd and even a loser. All right? So, flash ahead to 1926. Our nerdy loser hero of this story is getting ready for college. He's enrolled at Dartmouth College, and you can bet he is like chock full of dreams and hopes for the future, right? He's got a lot of things he's going to do. He's got fish he's going to fry, and they're big fish. But, and this is a big but. In fact, this is one of the biggest buts in this whole story. But despite that Ivy League education, despite all those hopes and dreams, he graduates from college and ends up getting a job as a copywriter for R.H. Macy and Company in New York. Now, he does that for a little bit, and then he becomes, an advertising manager for Gimbel Brothers, also in New York. Then, finally, in 1936, he moves to Chicago, where he gets a job. You know, the big breakthrough, right? He gets a job working as an in-house advertising copywriter for Montgomery Ward. Hopefully you're picking up the tone here. This kind of work isn't the glamorous career that he was dreaming of. And he later joked that instead of writing the great American novel, as I had once hoped, I was describing men's white shirts. Now, some of us have been there. Some of us, not naming names. You know, there's some mystery to this. Who could Dan be talking about? But some of us went through college with a million things we were going to do, and then we didn't do any of them. Other people did. Our classmates, they went on to succeed and be impressive people with big salaries. But some of us seemed to be far away from the docks when the boat finally came in. When my ship came in, I was somewhere else. I'm not saying me. You fill in the blanks. Some of us have had that experience. Whether you can relate to that or not, that's the situation that our hero was in. He comes from a long history of feeling inadequate, and it seems to be continuing into his adulthood. All right? But it gets worse. So I told you this was a little bit of a sad story. His situation gets worse. By 1938, life is just crazy tough for him. He's married and he's got a daughter, so there are some positives, some bright spots, but his wife is battling cancer, and all of that especially takes its toll on him around the Christmas of 1938. In fact, this guy who goes on to write this ridiculously popular Christmas story was sick and tired of Christmas. When January 1939 comes around and the city and the company that he works for, Montgomery Ward, when they all take down their Christmas decorations, he's relieved. He's so happy to see it go away. Most of us feel a little bummed out when that happens, when we see the decor come down and we realize it's over for the year. Our guy, he was thrilled. He was happy. Now that it was all down, he felt like he didn't need to walk around and fake that whole Merry Christmas thing. So he goes on like that for a few months, and then things take a turn. Finally, a good turn. Executives at Montgomery Ward, they seek him out. They'd been noticing the creativity, the excellence in writing that he put into the catalogs that he was working on. I guess he really leaned into describing men's shirts, maybe in a Dickensian manner. Maybe it was that brilliant. Anyway, that's what I like to think. These bigwigs from the company, they come to him and they ask him to come up with an original Christmas storybook to replace the coloring books that they usually give away every single season. Now, I can only imagine how he responded to that, at least internally. It's not been the best year for this. His wife's sick. He's feeling miserable as it is. He just barely got through Christmas of 1938, and now they want him to create some original Christmas story to be given out during the Christmas season of 1939. That's a big hill to climb and a lot of pressure, but he agrees and then goes to work. And drawing from his childhood experiences and his frustrations as a young adult and probably a middle-aged adult, and inspired by one of his favorite fairy tales, Hans Christian Andersen's The Ugly Duckling, Robert L. May writes one of the most beloved Christmas stories of all time. Now, I've given you the author, Robert L. May. Can you guess the name of the story? Have you figured it out? Robert L. May, I'm giving you 1 second here. Shout out the answer if you're smart and impress all the people around you. Robert L. May wrote Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. Now, we all know the story, a reindeer with a glowing red nose. He's mocked and excluded by the other reindeer. Ultimately, he becomes this hero, and he guides Santa's sleigh through a foggy Christmas Eve, right? Interestingly, when May first shared that story, that he drew on all of his own personal experiences to create, when he first shares that story, Montgomery Ward executives, they were a little hesitant at first. That red nose thing, that was concerning to them. Because at the time, that was usually associated with drunkenness, with alcoholism. It seemed a strange idea to bring into a kid's book. But when a colleague of May's illustrated the story and they saw the innocent little reindeer and his big glowing nose and not a trace of alcohol anywhere to be found in the pages, they embraced the idea and they gave him the go-ahead to finish the story. Now, unfortunately, during this time, May's wife passed away. However, despite all the grief and the struggle of that, and despite offers from people at Montgomery Ward's to find replacement writers, May sticks to it and he completes the story. That Christmas, Montgomery Ward ends up distributing 2.4 million copies of Rudolph, and it makes it an instant hit. But Rudolph didn't become the global phenomenon until years later when May's brother-in-law, this is another big twist to the story, May's brother-in-law, Johnny Marks, writes the famous song. And then Gene Autry, the cowboy, the singing cowboy, he records Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. It rockets up to the top of the charts, and it becomes one of the best-selling Christmas songs of all time, second only to Bing Crosby's White Christmas. Then, in 1964, Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer became a stop-motion animated TV special narrated by Burl Ives, and that version, that's become a Christmas staple for generations. Now, for many of us, it's really not Christmas till we see Rudolph save the day. All right, here are a few more interesting facts to wrap all of this up. The name Rudolph, that was chosen for its alliteration, but it wasn't his first choice. He first considered Rodney, Rollo, Reginald, and Romeo before finally settling on Rudolph. I would have loved to have had Romeo the Red-Nosed Reindeer. Doesn't quite have the pop, does it? Feels maybe like an adult version. Then the idea of the glowing red nose. That came to May as he looked out his Chicago office window one foggy winter day. He's watching the fog roll in, and he's just playing with ideas in his mind, and he wonders, how in the world would Santa navigate in weather like this? And then, boom, light goes on in his head, and he realizes Rudolph should have this bright red nose that leads the way. One last thing that I was completely unaware of, May wrote sequels. Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer Shines Again. That came out in 1954. And then Rudolph's Second Christmas, that was written a long time ago, but it wasn't discovered or rediscovered until 1992 after the author had died. And then I believe in 2006, it was published under the title Rudolph to the Rescue. Rudolph. As a kid, I loved Rudolph. As I got older, the magic of Rudolph kind of wore off. It just seemed a little silly. And we all know I am anything but silly. I live in a very serious spot, and Rudolph was just too silly for my seriousness. Learning the story behind the story really brings back some of the wonder, really brings back the idea of how much I really might like the story. Even in the darkest times, there's such a great message behind it. Even in the darkest times, the guy is going through the mill. Nothing turned out. He didn't live the life that he was dreaming. He loses his wife. In the midst of all of that, he still finds hope, peace, and all of that. And just the idea that if we're small and unworthy and feel that way, we still have a place and a purpose. I love that. I love the idea with Do You Hear What I Hear? That in the midst of darkness, in the midst of all of the sadness out there, there's still a light. There's still hope. That's what Christmas is all about. And that's what the Christmas Truce back in 1914. That's the same message that comes through. It's the message of Christmas. So from all of us at RepcoLite to you and your family, Merry Christmas. We hope you have a great one. Have a great weekend, and I'll see you next week. I'm Dan Hansen. Thanks for listening.